making them as long as possible, because again, another cost factor there is the crew that sits on it. And so that really probably contributed, as well as the specific maintenance issue of the bearing problems on one of the trains where the derailment happened in East Palestine. I don't know what's going on in Springfield, obviously, but I'm just speaking East Palestine. And that maintenance issue had nothing to do with the previous regulatory change that Trump rescinded from the Obama administration. It had to do with specific maintenance on that train. And so, the outplay of maintenance is an issue. The speed at which these trains are traveling these days is an issue. And these are all things that can and probably should be addressed. But the derailments may or may not have much to do with the regulation. I think it really has to do with an economic crunch that you're seeing lately. These railroads, some of them almost went out of business. They certainly were having financial problems. So let's just, COVID has had a lot of negative and dilatory effects. There are other issues with this, I grant, but COVID's had a deleterious effect on this too. And I think that that's one factor that is playing out here.
Breaking 4 News, what's your thoughts on this?
I just wanted to share a new statement from a spokesperson who works at Norfolk Southern, who confirms that approximately 20 out of the more than 200 cars derailed this afternoon, but does say that at this point there is, quote, no hazmat involved in this situation. Now, aerial footage that Raw's Alerts shared does show some train cars, the black cylindrical cars that are known to carry those kind of elements that may be dangerous, that at least one is involved in the derailment itself, but we don't know what it's carrying. Sometimes it could be carrying milk, or sometimes it could be empty. So we'll wait to hear more information, but Norfolk Southern at this point saying that no hazardous material is involved in this derailment.
Intel?
Yeah, so in terms of the speed limits, there are actually limits of speed. I had to double check the specific one. So passenger rail has its own set of speed limits, and then the freight rail has speed limits that are split into 2 categories, without signaling and with signaling. And then there's a third category, which is known as like dark territory, which kind of goes into it's kind of like a subsection of without the signals. And this particular train, it was technically below the speed limit. So the speed limit was 60. It was going 59 according to the NTSB. So it's like 1 mile, not a huge difference. And then the individual class 1, all railroads, whether it's class 1, class 2, class 3, further refine the speed limit based off the grade and the curvature and the condition of the track. So like example, the railroad I was on, according to the books, we could technically on paper, the maximum allowed speed limit, could be 60, but our timetable had it as 45. But due to the condition of the tracks and the age of the tracks, we had a special instruction that the speed limit maximum allowed was 10 miles an hour.
So obviously my question, and I think Emerging, you might be able to answer this as well. The question is this, like from someone who's not from the United States, why has this situation, and everybody agrees, whether they, up to now, all the speakers have agreed that there's been a lack of focus on the infrastructure of in the United States, and that has caused, that is a significant factor that may have caused this. And then you said train derailments. Why isn't people?
I think that generally, like, it's been tough to get an infrastructure bill passed, which the Biden administration work putting these bills, and I think in order to get them to agree, these bills are being put out with so many special interest lines in them, where it strays from the actual infrastructure that you're trying to boosts in the country. So I think that's one of the main issues. Like they did push one through, which I think is a big accomplishment, and it's not going to be the railroading. It's like Jim said. I think there could be some money going to railroads, but ultimately, I think it's mostly for bridges and tunnels.
That wasn't a completely, and in fact, we haven't done this in Congress for some time in a substantive way. That was not a typical infrastructure bill. That was more like a continuing. It wasn't precisely a continuing resolution, but the way it was worked was like a continuing resolution. It was written by the Speaker's office and with the help of lobbyists, and it just got slapped onto the floor because we've got an infrastructure problem. The typical appropriations process in Congress has not been taking place for nearly 20 years now. The 1974 Budget Act requires Congress to run 12 appropriations bills, to work them through the year, and to get them done by September 30th. That's the requirement of the 1974 Budget Act. We have not been following that process for nearly 20 years. And the other issue is when these bills get to the floor, both Republican and Democrat majorities in the House have restricted the ability of members of Congress to offer amendments. So ostensibly what you're trying to do with the various committees in Congress is those committees are kind of supposed to be the sort of experts, people that are working with those issues all the time. And then they put out a bill to go to the floor, but there is some expertise and some insight that can come from other members of Congress if they can offer amendments on the floor. That has been highly restricted for years. This is one of the major and interesting, I don't know how it's going to play out yet, but interesting changes that took place in January 3rd through that whole week, where some Republicans were trying to get concessions from Speaker McCarthy, which they ultimately did, which will open up this process. You're going to get better bills that deal with things in a more clear way that doesn't have mere lobbyist input. Not all lobbyist input is wrong. Some of it can be useful, but it's mostly turned into a special interest way of doing things. And now you're going to get some better types of amendments. That's a big. So when you ask why aren't Americans upset about this, well, they aren't upset enough, and the reason is they don't understand the process that I just described, which I hope is understandable. That takes away a lot of the ability to think through these things more completely, instead of just having backroom deals taking place. And backroom deals killing this and other things when it comes to infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree 100%. But I think it's just that it doesn't impact the vast majority of Americans. It doesn't happen unless a bridge collapses, or like it's not happening to a lot of Americans, and it's not happening to me. Then why am I going to care about it? I think that's kind of the attitude in general that a lot of people.
In terms of why the rail infrastructure has been upgraded, we're going to push passenger rail to the side because it's a little bit more tricky because there is some federal involvement versus the freight rail. Predominantly the freight rail is private, so most of the rail cars are owned by the company that makes the product or by banks. It's not owned by Norfolk Southern or whatever the rail company is. So like every single car in the train, you're not going to see a Norfolk Southern label slapped on it. You'll notice like a bunch of different companies. So they're typically responsible for their cars. And then you have, in terms of the tracks, predominantly, it's company property, so they would be predominantly responsible. The FRA, it also too, a big thing with it is, so like example, the FRA has a lot more control over the airports and our air infrastructure, because the airports and a lot of that facility and the infrastructure behind our air, like air traffic, is public versus.
I just think he dropped out. I am getting a lot of reports of audience members dropping out as well, not being able to hear. So I think after the crash we had earlier, and Ian said spaces are crashing today, I think we're having issues. But I think that we'll keep watching the story carefully. If there's more developments, we'll start a space. But since spaces is crashing, I think we'll call it off for now. Nick will be joining us a bit later. He's in a meeting now, but I won't do a space if it's not worth it. I'll just tweet about it. But if the situation does evolve, we'll cover it. But otherwise, we've done the breaking news. We've covered the Ohio train derailment briefly. I don't think it's worth a space, and nothing serious yet. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of call it off. Slayman, I don't think there's anything more to add. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's it. I think we got as much out of it as we could, really.
Yeah, and I'm seeing speakers drop off as well.